we were supposed to have 5 people on today, but sadly not everybody can make it. So it's just myself, Claire, and you, Sarah. So we were thinking, actually, as it's a small but perfectly formed intimate group, is how do we want to use the time that we've got today? Because I've got this whole deck that I've created for this session, which has got some nice, useful information in there, some insights that I've garnered from some of the state of the nation reports, but also some opportunities to kind of share some feedback models that I use with my clients and work well in the contact center industry. So rather than see this as a training session and a workshop, I thought maybe we could use this as a bit of a, let's canter through the content and see if there's any kind of topics that we want to chat about, or anything that's relevant, or anything that's insightful that we want to share, or any experiences that we've got, and just use it that way. Does that work for you guys?
Yeah, sounds great. Awesome.
So part of what I'm doing with this is the almost an abbreviated model for the 9-module remote leadership course that I'm promoting at the moment. And what I've done is condense some of this down, so it's a smaller session, but it gives some of the hints and tips and flavors of what we can do. And part of the extended course that I've created will be slightly longer on each of the tasks, more kind of content, and then an opportunity to do some performance coaching with leaders and observe them actually coaching the people that then benefit from their services, and giving them a little bit of feedback and creating development action plans for them so that they become more effective team leaders as a result, and doing that whole coach the coach program to see if you could satisfy one, more so from a training and competency perspective and the supervisory obligations that team leaders have to go through, but actually help senior leaders provide the support and development for team leaders that they get from having gone through a session. Because it's easy to put people through a training session and never actually follow up on it, which is typically what tends to happen in the contact center. We all know, we've all been there. So I'm trying to bridge that gap between training and operations, is I suppose where I'm coming from, which is where all these have come from. So the objectives that I was hoping to get from this, I don't have to tell you guys to stay off your phones, etc., but that's typical training fashion. But the course objectives of this one is just to understand a little bit about what the remote landscape looks like, understand why people tend to struggle remotely and how it's different to the face-to-face environment, look to provide some sort of value add and value share about how you can effectively support people having remote conversations, look at communication styles and how you can kind of adapt that to get the most out of the conversation, and understand some of the different feedback models and techniques to manage remotely. And I've just added this in as a placeholder to say, actually, what is leadership? When we boil it down to the nuts and bolts of leadership, it's no dark art. It's more around the kind of and I mentioned this in another session about how you make people feel and the difference that you can have from people walking through the door and feeling highly energized to people walking through the door and thinking, oh God, here they go again, and knowing whether you're going to get whacked over the head with it or whether somebody's going to come and make you feel great. And I liken it almost to the ripples in a pond and the impact that you have as that pebble. Are you going to have a positive impact, or are you going to have a negative impact? And that ripple in a positive way has the ability to really amplify the surroundings, the culture, the environment. But that ripple also has a very destructive pattern if not done in the right way. So what kind of ripple or pebble do you want to be is kind of the takeaway that leave people with that. And that as part of this kind of conversation is just more of a table discussion. So I just invite yourself and Claire to kind of have a thought about reflections and what kind of you think is happening in the leadership space with team managers at the moment.
So I think there's a even larger chasm between great and poor leaders. And, I've had conversations with people who, they've got a 9 a.m. and a 5 p.m. check-in with their boss every single day. And rather than feeling supported and empowered, they just feel like, it's am I at my desk and out on my PJs at 9? Am I not on the beers at 5? Am I being checked in on or checked up on? And I think that remote management gives it just broadens or puts under a telescope almost the difference between great leadership, who, you know, someone who thinks about the style of their employees and what they need and can flex that depending, to this is how it is. I don't trust you. I think you're all at home watching Jezza. You know, I'm gonna be checking in and you know, monitoring your email and your online time.
Yeah. Claire, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really is about understanding your people, and I've had managers who don't understand their people, and I've worked with managers who don't understand their people. It's like, come on, because one box doesn't fit everyone, and you need to be able to adjust your style accordingly. You know, I've worked with very diverse teams and multicultural. So I've managed teams in Singapore. You know, the culture in Singapore is completely different to the UK. But then my last BPO was in Belize, which is a completely different kettle of fish as well, and a lot more relaxed and casual, but also they do respect you.
Yeah, I think so. And I said this in a session that I was on not so long ago. If you think you had a bad manager face to face, wait and see how that manager is now that you're in a remote setting. And I think the words you used there, Sarah, earlier is the chasm. The difference in great leadership and poor leadership can be huge when you're in an environment where it's not your go-to, and actually being able to sit down next to somebody and put them at ease in a face-to-face environment is so much easier. Whereas actually having that same level of rapport and empathy and ability in a remote setting is almost impossible. And I thought it'd be useful just to kind of talk about some of the stats that I found when doing a little bit of research for this in terms of the landscape for remote working, because it's not all doom and gloom. When you look at some of the and this is from a State of Remote report, which was from 2019, so probably slightly changed since COVID, but this is the report that came out around remote working. And actually, there are some positives in remote working and things that people that work remotely really like and enjoy about being in that environment. I think the challenge with this is if we were to do the same survey for 2020, for those people that have been forced into a remote setting, would that change? Because generally people that work in a remote setting have been employed to work in a remote environment, and they like the flexibility, they like the ability to kind of be in multi-sites, multi-location, and they like the added flexibility that it brings with time with the family. So there's some really interesting stuff that comes out about the benefits of remote working. But on the flip side, there are generally some huge struggles that people in the remote setting tend to find. And that sits, those first two there for me are probably the two biggest that have been amplified in the COVID era. And I'd be interested to know, Claire and Sarah, what your thoughts are. Claire, does this resonate as someone who's working from home at the moment and kind of in a different position working from home?
Yeah, so working from home, I'm okay with personally. I didn't work from home previously. I was office based. You know, some Fridays I'd work from home. But certainly with my BPO, when obviously COVID first hit, you know, everyone was like great at first. And you're right, you know, spending more time with family and stuff. But the loneliness one, that was the biggest one, because as well in Belize, it's a very small populated country, so everyone knows each other and they really missed that interaction. We did particularly have an issue with unplugging after work. The agents were very good to knock off shift when they do, but then I know, not people who I've managed, but myself and my colleagues, you know, we were working till 5, 6, 7 on our cell phones and whatever. So yeah, that unplugging after work does get much harder.
Yeah. How about you, Sarah? Do any of those stats surprise you?
Not surprise me at all. And I think, yeah, the distractions at home is probably much higher this year, because you've got the kids stuck at home, you've got the partner stuck at home, you're fighting over who gets the office versus the dining table, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's really hard. The other thing that I'm really noticing with my coaching clients is the collaboration and communication, particularly for people starting a new role, developing that collaboration, the communication with teammates, getting to know the culture of an organization, incredibly difficult when that's done entirely remotely. And again, the chasm between great leaders and poor leaders. One guy that I'm talking to at the moment, I've been working with him for a few months. He's had no induction, literally zero induction. So he's just sat at home going, well, like, what do I do? How do I use the tools? Who do I talk to? He's 6 weeks in and feels totally cut adrift.
Yeah, and that's where systems and controls and training and competency and all that kind of infrastructure really comes into its own, isn't it? And making sure that you've got the right knowledge management tools, making sure that you've got the right system infrastructure. But ultimately, it boils down to, are you being led by the right person, and are you being given the right direction by the right person? Which is why remote leadership as a I suppose it's not even a tool, is it? It's a way of working is so important. And I think that collaborating and communication piece, I think, would probably in the 2020 environment probably sit either 1 or 2 in that ability to kind of collaborate with somebody. I can't now turn to the person to the right of me and tell them what a crappy day I've had or how much of an ass this customer was. So I think that's those 3 are probably in there, but I think there's probably a mix. I reckon loneliness and isolation, or feeling isolated, is probably ranked more number 1. And I think there's some interesting stats that I don't know whether I shared with you guys that Katie Forsyth has done from Red Recruitment. I'll send you a copy, Sarah. It's a really interesting report that Katie's done. She interviewed 54 senior leaders from the contact center industry and asked them these types of questions. And I think mental health and feeling of isolation is definitely up there. Yeah. So it got me thinking about how remote conversations can be really tough. And we thrive off that facial stimuli. We thrive off body language, and not everybody is as animated as me on Zoom, so they can't get that feeling of interaction that they all get. And some people sometimes just sit there with the camera switched off, which is never easy to kind of judge and read people's faces when you're talking to a black screen. And we like to feel that kind of tactile nature of kind of that brief touch, or that touch of the knee, which sometimes might get you in trouble, you never know, but we like to kind of get into that position where we like to build a relationship through the comfort of knowing someone and being around them. So in terms of how we're approaching this in the kind of the flow of this, more of an open discussion about what's on team leaders' plates. What are some of the challenges that they're facing themselves that they might not be able to talk to their own direct line manager about, again, because it's maybe done in a remote setting. But also, what are the types of conversations that your teams are bringing to your table that they're having to deal with? Because those feelings of isolation are probably being amplified to the team leaders, and the team leaders are taking it on their shoulders and having to deal with some of that. And I know certainly from my team leader days, the face-to-face conversations that I used to have with people who were in the office were hard enough, let alone having to then support those conversations from a distance. So just generally kind of what's your experience thus far from some of the conversations that you've been having, Sarah?
So I think a big piece is the corridor conversations. If you're struggling with something, you can bump into someone, whether you engineer that or whether it's just by chance. But you can, can I just pick your brains on? And you cannot do that in the same way. Yes, you can drop them a hangout or drop them an email saying, look, can we have a quick chat on? But it immediately feels more formalized or more contrived than I bumped into you at the coffee machine and we can just have a bit of a chat about it. It's that informal, broader support network that's so much harder when it's entirely remote.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Claire and I were in a workshop with some other teams yesterday, and it was one of those things is to say, actually, when you send that invite, is can you just join this Zoom? Is the equivalent of, can we just go into a room for a second? And it brings in that anxiety and that apprehension of what have I done? What have I done wrong? Why am I being summoned to a room? So it is that kind of psychological barrier that goes up as soon as somebody formalizes something in the form of an invite, isn't it? Claire, Claire, what's your thoughts on that?
I certainly found when we first moved to working from home due to COVID that the team leads were feeling it more than ever, because they felt that the agents were reaching out to them even more than when they were in the office. So we did have some struggles with the team leads, definitely, because again, the agents are sat at home on their own. A lot of them had young families and stuff. And especially in my night shift team lead as well, that was pretty tough for him. But with some coaching and some hints and tips, he overcame it, but he felt he was being spread really thin because everyone was pulling on him all the time.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that when I ran these sessions earlier on in lockdown one. The communication overwhelm that team leaders were experiencing was huge, is because they go instinctively into solutions mode.
Yeah.
And they set up a million different WhatsApp groups.
Yeah.
They've got loads of messengers going on. So they're being communicated over here, they're being communicated over there. And it's like, suddenly I can't sort out what's business related, what's social, and I can't work out and people think that they've then got access to you almost 24/7 to a certain extent, because they're like, well, I'll just message, and it becomes instant, that instant interaction, rather than you're in the office, I can only speak to you when you're there, or I can only speak to you if you've not got your headset on. They don't understand that kind of interruption piece. So yeah, Sarah, you're nodding profusely there. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's the visual cues, isn't it? So I can give a visual cue that I'm kind of open to having conversations, or I can give the visual cue that right now I'm head down getting my stuff done, and it can be harder to switch off those distractions. And yeah, when you've got 7-year-old screaming, Netflix in the background, husband shouting for something, and 14 advisors all sending you a message, it can be hard to find the right moment to respond appropriately.
So if we put ourselves in the shoes of the team leader then, and actually thinking about how we could help them if we were doing that role still, which probably a few years ago, a while since we've done it, but what would, I suppose, be the advice and thoughts to kind of help a struggling team leader right now? Sarah, what would your kind of top tips be to help leaders in a remote setting at the moment?
The first thing I'd say is be honest with your team. Tell them why that's a challenge and that you want to be there for them, but that you need to do it in a way that isn't overwhelming for you as well. So to Claire's point earlier, understanding that everyone has slightly different needs and everyone has a different way of being, but you know, you'll always be available online between this time and that time. If somebody needs something specifically, to get in touch with you via this method. And be really honest with them about your challenges and struggles. I think being confident enough to be vulnerable with your team shows a real strength of leadership.
You know, that's a really, really important point there. That vulnerability piece is actually accepting that I'm going through the same challenges as you are. I've got the same, maybe, children in the background. I've got the same IT struggles that you're going through, and actually being in it with them. And letting them know that you're just as human, and you're not this superpower hero that all team leaders must have the strength of an ox. Actually, I don't. I'm just as normal as you are. There are things in my environment that are the same. Claire, what's your thoughts on that? What tips would you share?
Some of that is exactly what we did. So we knew that team leads, they have their own meetings and stuff. So we asked all the team leads to post up their schedules. Now, we all know schedules can change, of course they can, but they used to post up when they would be scheduled to be in a meeting, etc. But we also had what we called our subject matter experts in each team, who were kind of like the team leader's assistant. But this gave us a real opportunity to really promote those guys and really use them as the first point of contact before they then got to the team lead, because they were agents, but agents who were just a little bit better, a little bit smarter, probably more tenured as well. We also buddied agents up. So they'd have their own teams rooms and things, and we buddied them up just to relieve a bit of pressure, but definitely for them to be transparent was the main thing.
Yeah, and I think it's also just being really clear as to when you are available and when you're not available. And one of the suggestions that I made to one of the team leaders that I did some coaching with back in the first wave is actually have a bit of a block of time where it's your time, but also have a bit of almost like a co-working hour where you just put in the diary, I'm available for an hour. If you want to drop into the Zoom, here's the link. Come and talk to me about whatever's on your mind, whatever's on your challenge, or whatever you're working on that you need some support with. And just creating that accessibility is really, really key. But being clear with when is, and that whole new contracting piece, isn't it? It's like we're in a new environment, so we've got a new contract. I might be doing this, I might be doing that, but here's where I'm available, and I'll be available to you as much as I possibly can. But the spans of control, I'm managing 15 people, and just reminding them that there is a balance that needs to be made from both the employee and the team leader, which is great.
Yeah,
awesome.
Making that same thing available, but from a peer support perspective. So, you know, there's a virtual kitchen that you can pop into if you just want to have a natter with someone for 2 minutes because you've come off a really crappy call.
Yeah, I mean, you said it earlier, corridor conversations. I call them water cooler conversations, where you just had a really livid conversation with your boss and you just need to talk to somebody about it.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So these are some of the things that I came up with just to summarize tips for remote conversations. Was really the technology piece is the thing that confounds a lot of people initially. So get comfortable with the technology, use the technology to its fullest. Talking to people with camera on is really important. Thinking about people's different learning styles, your visual learners, your auditory learners. Share things where you can. Send things out in the email so they've got copies of it. If people want to print stuff, make sure they've got access to printing materials and stuff. Thinking about how you can create that face-to-face by using technology like pinning the speakers so it has that kind of twofold dialogue, and create a communication platform that works. Like segmenting those personal and business communications, I think, is useful as well. One of the top tips we talked about in one of the previous sessions was have a WhatsApp for business and have a WhatsApp for social. And that way, actually, if it's a business SOS, you're WhatsApping the business one, and I can respond to you more effectively there rather than that whole overwhelm piece. And then it's just, I think you talked about it earlier, Sarah, it's like that planning piece and creating that structure. So allowing time to kind of build that rapport and build that empathy, and allowing the pleasantries. So it's not just straight into business, because you wouldn't do that in a normal one-to-one, would you?
No.
You wouldn't, but suddenly in this setting, it's like, all right, let's get down to business. And I think some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here in terms of that being confident, to your point, Sarah, and being vulnerable enough to be able to give that feedback is really important. And sharing things and that communication piece is really clear. But we talked about it just a second ago in terms of that whole new contracting piece. So being really clear in expectation and agreeing new ways of working, and understanding and accepting that we're all in a different scenario, that actually you might need to go and get the door if it goes, or you might need to move the kids out of the, I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that clip of the newsreader who's interviewing somebody and the kid sort of like comes along, and that stuff happens. It's remote, so it's accepting that. And whether you're on the phone to your director or videoing into a conference call, stuff is going to happen. So just immunizing yourself in that way. So I think for me, one of the biggest things in remote working is creating the right environment. And we've touched on it a lot already, but being able to allow people to evidence a little bit of vulnerability, but preparing them in a way that gives them the opportunity to know that when something's going wrong, you're comfortable enough to be able to vocalize it, that it's going wrong. And I'll talk a little bit here about creating that psychological safety within teams, and understanding how team managers or team leads, whichever kind of role that we're looking at, is creating that trust within their team and their kind of their social dynamic, if you like, to be able to confidently and comfortably have honest and open conversations. So in terms of that psychological safety element, Sarah, what have you noticed within some of the conversations that you've been having with some teams or with individuals that are in your work sphere that kind of might hamper or complement that ability to create a good psychological safety environment?
So have you heard of Radical Candor by Kim Scott?
That book does ring a bell, actually.
It is, honestly, it's absolutely brilliant. It's on Audible if you don't have time to sit down and read a book. She's a slightly drawly Texan, but if you can get past that, the content is amazing. And what she talks about is to build that psychological, she doesn't use the phrase psychological safety, but to build that sense of real trust, you need to show that you care personally. And if you care personally without any challenge, then you're just in ruinous empathy. And if you don't care, but you give the challenge, then I can't remember the phrase she used, but basically you're an asshole. And there's this sweet spot where you genuinely care about your people, but you can be quite direct with them as well. And they can be quite direct with you. And I think the challenge this year is developing that relationship and that closeness where you know and your staff know that you care personally. And doing everything that we've talked about up until this point, you know, being aware of their needs, being aware of their realities, and flexing and adjusting your style to help them goes part of the way. But really developing that rapport and closeness so that you can be quite direct with them and welcome them to be quite direct with you is what you need to really get to that performance and growth space.
Yeah, and I think you said it very early on, Sarah, is the mentality of some people where they're saying clock in at 9, clock out at 5, and actually ring me and check that you're doing that. And for me, that goes against all elements of trust that you're trying to build, and it creates that kind of bottom layer, doesn't it, where you've got really high standards, but you don't trust people. So actually, people think you're an asshole, and people think that, oh, you're checking up rather than checking in. And I think it's looking at this as a quadrant. We absolutely want to get to that top right with performance and growth. And I think it starts with that, particularly in a remote setting, to say, right, if you can get all the work done between 9 to 5, and actually it takes 9 to 4, and you go and treat yourself for an hour, fair play. As long as you're not leaving a customer facing role where you're leaving cars abandoning, actually, I trust you to get the job done. And I think creating that environment and that culture, especially in a remote setting, is really, really important, because you'll get more productivity out of people. Claire, what's your kind of thoughts on this? How have you experienced this in your roles?
In a way, I guess because of how Belize is, as I said earlier, small populated, you know, that actually helped, because everyone does know everyone, and there is a genuine element of care. So I think in a way, my BPO was quite lucky with where they were based. Had I still been managing Singapore, would have been very, very different, definitely. They do tend to keep things back. They don't like to show their feelings so much. They don't like to show their care. It's a lot more business-like. So very different in cultures. Now, obviously, I came from a US company, so my bosses were US, and to be honest, my bosses perhaps didn't really care. It was all about them and not necessarily thinking about us in the UK. And so I experienced all of it.
And I think it's really key, isn't it? Because we don't often like talking about our feelings, and we can be typically British and say, oh, I don't want to burden you with my problem. Well, actually, a problem shared is a problem halved. And I think the key part for me, and we've talked about this already, is actually asking, how are you feeling? What's happening? Work aside, what's going on within the household? How are you struggling? How are you coping with where you're putting your PC, your desk? Are you getting regular breaks? Are you taking time away from the laptop? And I was speaking to an organization quite young in its team population, and this person was literally getting out of bed, logging onto the laptop, staying in the bedroom all day, and then going to bed and not really leaving the room. And that, for your health and your well-being, and that feeling of isolation and that kind of 4 walls and 1 window, can be so damaging. And actually, if your manager isn't sitting down and saying, right, are you getting some time out away from your desk or from your laptop, and thinking about, let's go on a walking one-to-one. Not everything has to be done by Zoom. So thinking about that, how you create that psychological safety and move away from that feeling of apathy and that culture of anxiety where you're checking in and checking out, I think is absolutely key in some of the remote working environments that we've got. So again, kind of getting teams to think about how they can create that. I think some of the ways that we have all the tools that we've got is having those open and honest conversations, positively role modeling some of the stuff that we're doing, holding people to account on both sides of the fence, providing that right feedback and timely feedback, continuing to have those kind of appraisal discussions and that kind of that one-to-one setting, making sure that one-to-ones happen and team meetings happen and that they've got the right structure to them. Talking about new ways of working, we touched on it already about creating new contracts and how people can interact and what to expect. Having interventions where interventions need to happen as a team and as a collective, and then looking at how we can communicate effectively. And what I've built into this section is just some ways or some methodologies that I think we can have some really good conversations. And I call it the capability circle. This is something that I kind of, from my years as kind of communicating as a manager, these are the 4 things I think you really need in order to make sure that you can have effective communication with people, in that you've got the clarity of thinking, you've got the clarity of instruction, you're being really specific about how you go about things and what's required of that person and the level of autonomy they've got within a role. Then how do you communicate it to them? When you're expecting an update, when should objectives be set, who owns what part, and how often do you expect to be updated on, and how clear people are and how honest they're being if something's going wrong, and then understanding the competence level within the individual that you've got and how that competence is changing, I suppose, in a remote setting to face-to-face. Are they really clear? What is their personal level of competence? Is there a difference now in the skills assessment that you need to do, in how confident you are with IT being one? That's a huge one in terms of people's ability to kind of understand how now to log onto the system remotely versus going in and doing it by your desktop. And that whole period of adjustment and that new speed to competency. And then the last bit I've touched about there about how do we create the capabilities, not necessarily the individual's capabilities, but the capability to do the job. So the resources, the system knowledge, the gaps, the tools, the physical capability to be able to do the job, and their actual ability to delegate if it needs to. And I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that whole communication piece and whether any of that stuff around that strange looking circle resonates. So Sarah, come to you. What's your thinking there?
Yeah, I'm just reading it all. It's very clear and communicated well.
Thank you very much.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to get to people to think about the different elements of it. So there's a difference between communicating and clarity, as in being absolutely crystal clear on what it is that you're wanting from your team, and then communicating it are 2 different things, and they get bundled together sometimes. And, you know, particularly team leaders under stress can think that they've done a great job of communicating, but actually it hasn't been clear and it's left confusion behind.
Yeah. And definitely, I mean, I know I can be clear in my head about what I want, but how I verbalize that and how I communicate it effectively and ask the person to maybe play it back as to what you've actually understood can be very, very different, especially in a remote environment where they might not be as confident to challenge as in kind of a face-to-face setting. Claire, what's your thoughts? Which one stands out most for you?
They all do, because they're all so important, and that they all underpin each other. Communication, definitely, and as I say, that wasn't an issue in Belize particularly, so that was quite good. But definitely competence. You know, you touched on it, the IT side of things. You know, when we moved my BPO to work from home, they didn't have laptops. We literally moved their desktops. So we had our facilities manager in the minibus over a week's period, putting everyone's stuff in. I had to train up, get 3 of my team leads and strong people trained up how to fix a computer together, you know, to get it set up at home, you know. So that and that came about the clarity and the communication and all of that, and then the capability. Were they capable of switching it on and not blowing up someone's house or something like that?
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting point, that, because I think when you look at we talk about contact centers and we think the agents that have to handle the calls for the customers. But of course, what you've got within that whole structure is you've got the shared services team as well, that are probably getting a handful, if not a truckload more calls in about, why is my VPN not working? Why can't I connect this? Why is my mouse freezing? Why can't I flip from this screen to that? So there's pressures on all sides, isn't there?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I think for me, leading on from that and that whole communications piece is how we make sure conversations that we're having are honest and we're still giving that feedback. And I talk within the contact center of different feedback models, and there's hundreds of different models that you can use. But I thought one that was really, really useful certainly in a remote setting was this one. It's called E squared C squared, which stands for evidence, understanding actually what they're doing. So going with a good fact base, understanding what your agent's doing that might not be right, or might be specific examples from either customer feedback or specific examples of activity that they're not necessarily doing, and what's the fact base. Then understanding and relating back the impact of that and the effect that that has on them as an individual, the organization, and the wider team. And I think that's a really important one within a remote setting, is that you don't, because you're not around the team in kind of a face-to-face environment, the team won't interact with you in the same way as they would in a remote setting. So actually you don't understand until somebody actually tells you that you're having a problem with the team. And if you're not having regular team meetings and you're not having regular discussion and the communication is lost, you're just going to end up getting on people's nerves, to put it politely, aren't you? So understanding how it can affect you, the organization, and the team is really important. And then the two areas that we look at for the C is, what do you want that person to continue doing that's working well? So how do you positively frame some of the stuff that they're doing that's actually doing a really great job, and actually not necessarily focusing always on the negative or the constructive, but really giving them an opportunity to say, right, this is working really well, carry on doing that, and actually dial it up even more. We want to see lots and lots more of that. But then there's also that, what you want to change. So what specifically do you want them to do differently? And I think the key word there is specifically. Being really specific about actually what it is that you're doing that is either having a negative impact or a suboptimal impact on the processes or the work that you're doing, and being really clear about that in terms of framing it in that discussion. Because I think if we look at this as a model, I think it can really logically flow and help the individual or the team member start to see the impact of what they're doing, and specifically the difference that they need to make. Have either of you seen this model before? Sarah, have you seen this before?
I haven't, but it's really similar to the big model. So the behavior, impact, and going forward, which is what I've used a lot. And it's just giving people that little mnemonic to make it really easy for them to give swift and direct feedback in the moment, rather than, kind of collecting it all and making it into something bigger than it is. So I think anything that helps people just be, this straightforward and I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but in the moment and constructive. It's really
direct and to the point, isn't it? It really covers the essentials of what you need to get, but it gives you as a team leader thinking, actually, how do I make sure that this lands in the right way? And that's the thing, isn't it? In terms of the messages that we're trying to get to people in a remote setting, that they're not then going to go away and sit on and stew for half an hour thinking, why have I just had this feedback? Claire, what's your thoughts on this model?
Definitely getting the balance with the positive, and that's something we actively encourage. So lots of our feedback was through voice of the customer. So for example, the customers come back and said, you didn't answer all my questions. So we would always start off with, you answered question 1 and 2 absolutely brilliantly, but then you missed question 3. So really starting off with the positives, I think, is really important. And again, depending on the culture as well, I think that's even more critical.
Yeah, I mean, I've used this model and a model called Boost, which is all the behavior, what you observed, what's the second O? It's what the options are for you to do something different, how specific you want to be with that piece of feedback, and then how timely you do it. So Boost is another really good one that can really help. Just focus on that behavior and the fact that you've observed it, or it's been brought to your attention, and kind of being specific in that way is really, really key. And I think really helps just kind of play out the conversation in your own head as a team leader to say, right, I'm going to have this conversation and this is how it's going to flow. Can immunize yourself from anything going wrong there.
But even from my point of view, because I was the vendor manager as well, so obviously I was managing the client, so that was all remote, and obviously because I'm a vendor manager, I could be quite strong, and if I wanted to be, I could be quite harsh. If no one turned up to work, I'd give them what for, but I would always make sure I'd find the positive first, always.
Definitely. Sarah, what were you going to say there?
I was just going to say it's really important using those models to give positive feedback as well.
Yes.
So we think of feedback in terms of what we want someone to stop or change, but actually when we catch them doing something brilliant, using exactly the same model to give great positive constructive feedback is also really critical and helps build confidence that the model works.
I think we're conditioned for feedback to be negative, aren't we?
Yeah.
We instantly think that it's going to be negative. And I think when we're giving feedback, absolutely focus on the positives, match some of those verbal and non-verbal messages, focus specifically on the behavior rather than the person. I think we've all suffered from that in one way, shape or form. Encourage that opportunity to reflect. I think we give somebody that piece of feedback and then say, right, and you need to do it on the next call, or you need to do it in the next interaction. Well, actually, if my learning style is to really absorb that, I might not necessarily nail it on my next interaction. So let me reflect and then give me some more feedback on how I've made that change. Keeping it simple, obviously, be sensitive to the impact of the message and make sure that you're doing it in the right way, I suppose. So then it's an opportunity, I suppose, to talk through in your teams of how you use that model and bring it to life. And I think for me, if you confuse what we talked about in the first half around building that trust and that psychological safety, building and understanding kind of what some of the restraints are and what some of those conversations might be, being really clear in your communication style and having a really good model to feedback, I think it's going to help for a much more conducive relationship between you in one kind of end of the country versus talking to somebody else in one end of the country in a remote setting. So this was the whole kind of section around how we summarize it. And I suppose thinking about the landscape of the employees and where they're at and the environment that they're in, thinking about how leadership styles need to adapt and how you yourself can adapt with your line manager and then downwards to the people that you manage, understanding how you can build that level of resilience within teams by applying psychological safety principles and building up those trust levels, really communicating effectively so it's two-way and you're setting that expectation and you're contracting up front in a new way of working, and of course not shying away from feedback and making sure that as a business that you're still giving the feedback, you're giving little and often is the phrase I always used to say, so that it's not a surprise and you're not dragging somebody into a Zoom room and putting the fear of God in them. So really interested to get your thoughts on anything else that you think could be applied in a remote working setting, and any other tips or advice that you think you'd give to team managers managing teams remotely. Claire, let's come to you first. Any other thoughts and reflections?
I think they've got to be themselves. They shouldn't try and change necessarily and try and be someone else just because they're working from home. And again, it's all about that transparency, the honesty. There's no harm in that. And sometimes team leads and sometimes ops managers don't like to admit they've been wrong, or they don't like to admit they've made mistakes. And that's even more important when you're not with the people, definitely.
Yeah. Being present as well, I think, is the other,
yes.
isn't it? It's like so easy to do your emails or something else, and actually people can sort those visual cues with their eyes and they know you're not focusing. Sarah, any final thoughts and wrap up from yourself as to what you think the remote workers could do?
Yeah, so I think the one I was going to say was about that being present, and it's very, very hard with the distractions, but it's exactly that. It's making sure that you don't think that you can just quickly do this without anyone noticing, because it's absolutely blatant. But also I think there's an opportunity for leaders to be role models and to be truly authentic. And one of my absolute passions is about enabling people to feel more authentic at work and therefore less like an imposter. And I think when you've got you can put your false background there and pretend like you're in an office and pretend like everything is perfect and that you're not struggling, but you're going to miss the opportunity to really connect with your team, to really have that close rapport and trust and psychological safety. You've got the opportunity when you're in your home, you know, people are sat, they're in your office, they're in your bedroom, they're in your kitchen, wherever it might be. You've got the opportunity to show more of yourself and to be more vulnerable and transparent with your team, and to really, you know, lead from the front in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that it was planned to be a training workshop, but I think we've turned that from a training workshop into what could be considered an almost awesome little podcast or little interview scenario. So that's been really useful. I think it's really great to have people like yourselves on these courses, because actually you can impart some real great nuggets of how you've done it, what's experiencing, and what we can do to kind of help drive and affect some change. So it's been lovely. It's not the session that I planned, but as with all these remote sessions, like we say, we have to adapt, and I think we've adapted that really, really well. I think there's some great nuggets within what we've done here that I'm happy to share. So I recorded this as a session, so happy to send it to you guys if you want to kind of share it and edit it down or anything. I think it could be really, really useful, and I'll certainly plug it. But yeah, brilliant. Awesome catching up with you, and nice to finally see you, Sarah. I think I've seen you on some of the contact center network calls, but nice to kind of see you and actually start having a conversation and understand a little bit more about you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, likewise. And Claire, if you want to connect on LinkedIn, if I can connect you to anyone, introduce you to anyone, help in any way, then please just shout.
Brilliant, thank you.
No worries at all. Best of luck.
I'm going to wrap it up there and wish you both a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm sure I'll say that again to you multiple times, because I'll
tomorrow.
Well, Friday if I actually make it.
Brilliant. But I'll leave it there then, and thank you very much for joining. Take care.
Great.
Thank you.
Cheers,
See you later.
Bye bye.